I was driving to hear my son's last will and testament. When I got in the car, my neighbor, as a proth, the day I got the call, my world stood still. They told me my son had left something behind for me, a final will and testament. My hands shook as I grabbed my car keys, the weight of grief pressing down on every breath. But just as I slid into the driver's seat, I glanced up and saw my neighbor standing there waiting for me, with a look in their eyes that told me this ride was going to change everything I thought I knew about my son. If you're still listening, I know this story has already gripped your heart. Here on Story Globe, we bring you tales that remind us of the fragility of life, the power of family, and the secrets that can hide in the people closest to us. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Let's journey through this story together. When you lose a child, the world doesn't just dim, it collapses. I never thought I'd be the kind of parent who would sit in a courtroom to hear their child's last words written on paper. But life, as I've learned, doesn't ask for our permission before breaking our hearts. That morning, I received the call from the attorney's office. My son had left a will. A will? I repeated the word over and over, as if saying it could somehow change its meaning. He was only 25 years old, healthy, smart, with a future so wide it could stretch across the whole of America. And yet, here I was, being summoned like an old man at the end of some unfinished chapter. I remember walking out of my house in Montgomery, Alabama. The air was heavy, that southern humidity that clings to your skin even in the shade. My neighbors were out tending to their yards, mowing, watering, pretending life was normal. But nothing about my life felt normal anymore. I gripped my car keys so tightly that the ridges dug into my palm. The car, an old Chevy Impala my son used to joke about, sat waiting in the driveway. I opened the door, slid inside, and that's when I saw him, my neighbor, standing just a few feet away, staring at me. His name was Carl. He was the kind of man who waved every morning, the kind of man you thought you knew, until you didn't. His eyes didn't hold the casual kindness I was used to. They held something else, something that told me my son's story wasn't finished, something that whispered, "Don't drive off just yet." And in that moment, I realized the journey to hear my son's will wasn't just about the words he left behind. It was about the secrets buried in the people around me. Carl didn't move at first. He just stood there, arms crossed loosely, as if he'd been waiting for me to notice him. I rolled down the window halfway, more out of courtesy than curiosity. "Heading somewhere important?" he asked, his voice calm but with a weight underneath it. I didn't know how to answer. How do you tell your neighbor you're on your way to listen to your dead son's last words? So I muttered something short. "Yeah, I've got a meeting." Carl's gaze didn't leave mine. His eyes were the kind of blue that could look friendly in daylight, but right then, under the heavy Alabama sky, they looked almost cold. He leaned closer, lowering his voice like he was sharing something he wasn't supposed to. "Before you go," he said, "there's something you ought to know about your boy." My chest tightened. People had already said a lot about my son since he passed. Some painted him as an angel, others hinted at mistakes. But the way Carl said it, it wasn't gossip. It wasn't pity. It sounded like a warning. I gripped the steering wheel. "What are you talking about?" Carl glanced up and down the street, as if the manicured lawns and parked cars could have ears. Then he leaned in closer. "He came to see me the night before he died. Said he was scared. Said someone was following him." The words sank into me like stones. My son had never mentioned anything like that. Not once. And I wasn't the kind of father who ignored his calls. He and I spoke often, sometimes late into the night. If he'd been afraid, why hadn't he told me? Carl stepped back and stuffed his hands in his pockets. I didn't say anything at the time because, well, I figured it was just stress. He looked tired, worn out. I thought he'd sleep it off. But when I heard the news the next day, I realized maybe I should have done more. The air around me grew heavier. My ears rang, and suddenly the thought of driving off to hear a lawyer read my son's will felt hollow. What did a stack of papers matter if I didn't even know the truth about his last night alive? I switched off the ignition and pushed the door open. "Carl," I said, trying to steady my voice, "you need to tell me everything. Right now." He hesitated, and in that pause, I realized something else. Carl wasn't just my neighbor. He had been my son's confidant in ways I never knew, and as much as it hurt, I understood if I wanted answers, I would have to walk through the uncomfortable, messy truth of who my son really was and who he trusted when he thought the end was near. Carl motioned for us to step toward his porch, away from the curious eyes of passing cars. The boards beneath our feet creaked, the kind of old southern wood that had seen too many summers. I sat down slowly, more out of exhaustion than willingness. "He didn't waste time. Your boy showed up here about 10 o'clock that night," Carl began. He looked rattled, like he hadn't slept in days. He kept glancing over his shoulder like somebody might have followed him here. I leaned forward, every word cutting into me, and he said someone was after him. Carl nodded, not in those exact words. He said he was in too deep, that he'd gotten himself into something he couldn't just walk away from. The phrase hit me hard, in too deep. My son had always been ambitious, always reaching for more. He was the first in our family to graduate college, the one I bragged about at barbecues and church gatherings. He was supposed to be the example for his cousins, the light for our family, but in too deep sounded nothing like the young man I thought I knew. I clenched my fists. Did he say what it was? Carl shook his head. Not directly, that he mentioned names, people I didn't recognize. He said he was working on something bigger than himself, something that could either change his life forever or end it. I felt the air leave my lungs. The idea that my son had carried a burden like that without telling me was like being stabbed with a dull knife. Parents like to think they know their children, but in truth, we only know the parts they allow us to see. Carl leaned back, his gaze heavy. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd make sure you knew he wasn't reckless, that he had his reasons. My throat tightened. His reasons for what? Carl looked away, and for the first time I realized he was struggling too, for leaving things behind, for writing that will in the first place. He knew his time might be short, even if he didn't say it outright. The silence that followed was suffocating. The cicadas in the trees buzzed like static, filling the space where my son's voice should have been. I thought about that will waiting for me downtown in the attorney's office. I thought about the formalities, the paperwork, the signature, but now it felt less like a routine legal matter, and more like a breadcrumb trail. My son had left behind something meant to guide me, if I was willing to follow. I stood up slowly. "Carl, you're coming with me," I said firmly. "If my boy left us both pieces of this puzzle, then we're going to put them together, right here, right now." Carl hesitated, then gave a short nod, and just like that, what started as a drive to hear a lawyer's reading had turned into a search for the truth, a search that would test everything I thought I knew about fatherhood, trust, and the dangerous paths even good men can wander down. Carl motioned for us to step toward his porch, away from the curious eyes of passing cars. The boards beneath our feet creaked, the kind of old southern wood that had seen too many summers. I sat down slowly, more out of exhaustion than willingness. "He didn't waste time. Your boy showed up here about 10 o'clock that night," Carl began. He looked rattled, like he hadn't slept in days. He kept glancing over his shoulder like somebody might have followed him here. I leaned forward, every word cutting into me, and he said someone was after him. Carl nodded, not in those exact words. He said he was in too deep, that he'd gotten himself into something he couldn't just walk away from. The phrase hit me hard. In too deep. My son had always been ambitious, always reaching for more. He was the first in our family to graduate college, the one I bragged about at barbecues and church gatherings. He was supposed to be the example for his cousins, the light for our family, but in too deep sounded nothing like the young man I thought I knew. I clenched my fist. Did he say what it was? Carl shook his head. Not directly, but he mentioned names, people I didn't recognize. He said he was working on something bigger than himself, something that could either change his life forever or end it. I felt the air leave my lungs. The idea that my son had carried a weapon like that without telling me was like being stabbed with a dull knife. Parents like to think they know their children, but in truth, we only know the parts they allow us to see. Carl leaned back, his gaze heavy. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd make sure you knew he wasn't reckless, that he had his reasons. My throat tightened. His reasons for what? Carl looked away, and for the first time I realized he was struggling too, for leaving things behind, for writing that will in the first place. He knew his time might be short, even if he didn't say it outright. The silence that followed was suffocating. The cicadas in the trees buzzed like static, filling the space where my son's voice should have been. I thought about that will waiting for me downtown in the attorney's office. I thought about the formalities, the paperwork, the signature, but now it felt less like a routine legal matter, and more like a breadcrumb trail. My son had left behind something meant to guide me, if I was willing to follow. I stood up slowly. Carl, you're coming with me, I said firmly. If my boy left us both pieces of this puzzle, then we're going to put them together, right here, right now. Carl hesitated, then gave a short nod, and just like that, what started as a drive to hear a lawyer's reading had turned into a search for the truth, a search that would test everything I thought I knew about fatherhood, trust, and the dangerous paths even good men can wander down. Carl slid into the passenger seat beside me, his presence both heavy and uneasy. For years he'd been nothing more than a neighbor, the man who trimmed his hedges on Saturdays, who waved as I drove past. Now he felt like the only key to unlocking the truth about my son. The Impaler's engine coughed to life, that familiar rumble echoing through my chest, as I pulled onto the main road toward downtown Montgomery. My hands trembled on the wheel. Every stop sign, every red light seemed to stretch longer than usual. My mind was already running laps, searching for answers I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. Carl stayed quiet at first, staring out the window at the lines of oak trees draped in Spanish moss. Finally he spoke. You ever notice how your boy never liked sitting still? I managed a half smile, though my throat was dry. He was always chasing something. Even as a kid, he couldn't stay put. Carl nodded. That's what worried me. He had that restless energy. But the night he came to me, it wasn't just restlessness, it was fear. And not the kind of fear you shake off with a drink or a good night's sleep. It was the kind that crawls into your bones. The words made my chest tighten. I remembered nights when my son would call me from college, saying he was tired but pushing through exams. I remembered how he worked 2 jobs after graduation, just to make rent in Birmingham, refusing to come home because he wanted to prove he could stand on his own. I'd admired that about him, his grit, his determination, but now I wondered, had that same fire pulled him into something darker? Carl shifted in his seat, lowering his voice, as if the empty road could listen in. He said there were people offering him opportunities, quick money, fast connections, but he also said he wasn't sure he could trust them. I told him to step back, but you know how young men are, they think they can outrun the storm. I gripped the wheel tighter. He never told me any of this, not once. Carl glanced at me. Maybe he didn't want to worry you, or maybe he thought he could handle it on his own. The silence in the car grew thick. I rolled past the familiar corner store, the one where my son used to buy sodas as a teenager. I could still picture him coming out with a can in hand, smiling like the world was his for the taking. That memory stabbed me deeper than any blade could. I swallowed hard. So what exactly was he into, Carl? Drugs? Gambling? Debt? Carl shook his head slowly. I don't think it was that simple. He mentioned something about a project, something with a group he trusted at first, but when he realized what they were really after, he started to back out. That's when the fear set in. I exhaled sharply, frustration boiling inside me. A father's greatest fear isn't just losing his child, it's realizing there were entire parts of their life you never even touched. We rode in silence for a mile or two, the hum of the engine filling the space. Then Carl spoke again. I think whatever's in that will, it's not just money or property. It's a message, maybe even a confession. The thought chilled me. My son's last words to me weren't going to be spoken in his own voice. They were going to come through ink on paper, chosen carefully, maybe even desperately. And now, with Carl beside me, I understood. This wasn't just about grief. It was about truth. And truth, I feared, might hurt more than the loss itself. Downtown Montgomery looked the same as always. Brick sidewalks, faded awnings, a courthouse that had seen generations walk through its doors. But to me, every building seemed heavier that day, as if the whole city knew I was about to hear the last words of my only son. I parked in front of the law office. The sign above the door read Miller and Associates, the kind of firm that smelled of leather and dust, the kind that had shelves lined with books no one touched anymore. Carl and I walked in, the cool air from the AC clashing with the heavy humidity outside. A receptionist with neat glasses and a soft smile asked my name, then led us down a narrow hall. My footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, each one pulling me closer to the truth. The attorney was a tall man in his 50s, with a graying beard and the steady kind of voice that lawyers must practice in the mirror. His nameplate read James Miller. He shook my hand firmly, then glanced at Carl with a flicker of curiosity. I wasn't expecting anyone else. Miller said, "He's with me," I replied quickly. My tone left no room for argument. Miller gestured for us to sit. His office was tidy but lived in stacks of files, family photos, diplomas framed in dark wood. On the desk sat a manila envelope. My son's name was written across the top in bold ink. Just seeing his handwriting there nearly undid me. Miller cleared his throat. "Your son came to me about 3 weeks before his passing. He was insistent on putting his affairs in order, though at his age, I questioned why. He said he had his reasons." I leaned forward, my heart pounding in my ears. The attorney slid the envelope closer and began to read. His voice was steady, but to me, it felt like thunder shaking the room. "To my father," Miller began. My chest tightened. It was my boy's voice in my head now, not the lawyer's. "I know this will come as a shock, but I need you to understand that everything I've done, every choice I made was because I wanted to build something bigger than myself. I didn't want to worry you, but I realized too late that the road I took was more dangerous than I thought. If you're hearing this, it means I couldn't finish what I started. But I don't want you to think I was careless. The truth is I left something behind, something important, and I need you to protect it." The attorney paused, glancing at me over his glasses. My breath caught in my throat. Carl shifted in his seat, leaning forward. Miller continued, "I've placed a key in a safe deposit box at First National Bank. Inside, you'll find documents and instructions. You'll also find names, people you may not recognize, but they matter. Trust no one blind. Not everyone who says they're on your side truly is. If you want to know the whole story, follow what I left behind." The room went silent. The only sound was the soft hum of the AC above us. I sat frozen, the words circling in my head like vultures. My son hadn't just left money or property. He'd left a trail, a secret to uncover, a mystery he knew would outlive him. Carl rubbed his jaw. "I told you," he muttered under his breath. He knew something was coming. I looked at the attorney, my voice barely steady. "And that's all he left." Miller hesitated, then slid another paper across the desk. His eyes softened. "He also left a letter, handwritten, specifically addressed to you." My hand shook as I reached for it. The envelope was thin, the kind that carried more weight in words than it ever could in paper. My son's handwriting curled across the front. "For Dad when I'm gone." And in that instant, the air seemed to leave the room. I wasn't ready to read it, but I knew those words inside were going to tear open every wall I'd built around my grief. The letter trembled in my hands before I even tore it open. It felt heavier than it should have been, like the paper itself carried the weight of my son's soul. Carl sat silently beside me, his presence steady but uninviting. The attorney leaned back in his chair, giving me space, though his eyes revealed the curiosity of a man who'd read hundreds of wills, but had never seen one quite like this. I slid my finger along the seal and unfolded the pages. The handwriting was familiar, the same loops and slants I'd seen on birthday cards, grocery lists and little notes he used to stick on the fridge. My boy's hand, my boy's voice. Dad, the letter began. If you're reading this, I've already failed to protect myself, but more than that, I've failed to keep my troubles from reaching you, and that's the hardest part for me to accept. I swallowed hard, the words already blurring through tears. I know you raised me to stand on my own 2 feet. You taught me what hard work means, what honesty means. But I need you to forgive me, because the choices I made weren't simple. I thought I was helping people. I thought I was building something honest. By the time I realized it wasn't, I was too far in. My fingers gripped the paper tighter. Each sentence pulled me deeper into a world I didn't recognize. There's money, the letter continued. Not much, but enough. You'll find details in the bank box. But what matters more are the names. Dad, these names, they'll explain everything. They'll show you who was with me and who was against me. Some of them are good, some of them aren't. Carl knows a piece of it, but not the whole story. Trust him where you can, but don't stop digging. I stopped, glancing at Carl, who was staring at the floor, jaw tight. My heart ached at the thought of my son trusting this man with parts of himself he hadn't trusted me with. I looked back down at the letter. If anything happens to me, don't let it end with silence. Don't let people write me off as careless, and don't let anyone convince you I wasn't trying to make you proud. Everything I did, even the mistakes, came from wanting to give back more than I ever received. If you decide to follow this trail, Dad, be careful. It's bigger than you think, and it's not over just because I'm gone. The final words were smudged, as if written in a rush, or maybe with a shaking hand. I love you, Dad. Always. Luke. I couldn't breathe. For a moment, the room faded, the bookshelves, the attorney, even Carl. All I could see was my boy at the kitchen table years ago, working through homework, tapping his pencil like he always did. That same hand had written these words, words that now felt like both a gift and a curse. Carl cleared his throat softly, breaking the silence. You see now why I couldn't keep quiet. He wanted you to know. He wanted you involved. But involved in what? The money? The names? The danger he hinted at? I folded the letter carefully, sliding it back into its envelope. I looked at the attorney, then at Carl. My voice was quiet, but firm. We're going to that bank. Today. Because if my son had left me one last task, one final journey to understand him, then I wasn't about to let fear or grief stop me. He'd asked me to follow the trail, and for him, for the boy I raised, the man I lost, I was ready to follow it wherever it led. The drive to First National Bank was silent, each of us trapped in our own thoughts. Carl sat with his arms folded, staring straight ahead. I kept replaying Luke's words over and over. It's bigger than you think. Don't let it end with silence. The bank stood tall on the corner of Washington Avenue, a brick building with white columns that looked more like a courthouse than a place to store paychecks. Inside, it was cool and sterile, with polished marble floors that echoed every step. The tellers gave polite smiles, but my heart was pounding too hard to return them. We approached the front desk, where a young man in a navy suit greeted us. I handed him the paperwork Miller had given me. He skimmed it, nodded, and disappeared through a side door. My palms were sweating. This wasn't just about documents anymore. This was about stepping directly into my son's world. Minutes later, we were escorted into a narrow hallway lined with metal drawers. The vault smelled faintly of steel and old paper, the air heavier than any church I'd ever stepped into. The clerk inserted a key, then handed me the second one, the one Miller had passed down from Luke. My hands trembled as I slid it into the lock. With a click, the small door swung open. Inside was a plain manila folder and a black leather notebook, worn at the edges. I lifted them out slowly, almost expecting them to burn my fingers. Carl leaned in, his jaw tight, his eyes searching. We sat at a small table, the clerk excusing himself to give us privacy. I opened the folder first. Inside were several documents, bank statements, receipts, and what looked like unsigned contracts. But tucked among them was a typed sheet with a single sentence at the top. If anything happens to me, start here. Below it was a list of names. Some were familiar local business owners, a professor from Auburn University, even a councilman whose face I'd seen on campaign posters, but others were complete strangers. Each name had a number beside it, like a code. I glanced at Carl, who frowned deeply. "These aren't random," he muttered. "These are people he was dealing with, but why give them numbers?" Before I could answer, I opened the black notebook. Its pages were filled with Luke's handwriting, tight, fast, almost frantic in places. Dates, addresses, sketches of conversations, even small maps. It wasn't just a diary, it was a record. One page stood out. It was marked with a red X at the top. "Trust broken. Don't let him near Dad." And beneath it, a name. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a stranger. It was someone I knew. It was a man from our own neighborhood. Carl's face paled as he read it. He sat back, shaking his head. I knew he was worried, but I didn't know it went this far. The notebook suddenly felt like a bomb in my hands. Every line, every scribble carried a weight that could shatter reputations, even lies. My son hadn't just been afraid, he'd been documenting something big, something dangerous. And now, it was in my hands. I closed the book slowly. My voice was barely above a whisper. Whatever Luke was caught up in, it didn't die with him. And if he didn't trust people close to us, then we need to be very careful about who knows we found this. Carl nodded grimly. "You're right, because if these names are what I think they are, then some of the people on this list would do anything to keep us quiet." The vault suddenly felt colder. My grief had brought me here, but now, grief was the least of my problems. My son hadn't just left me memories, he'd left me a fight, one I wasn't sure I was ready for, but one I couldn't walk away from. When we stepped out of the vault, and back into the summer heat, the world felt different. The sound of traffic on Washington Avenue, the chatter of people on the sidewalk, it all seemed sharper, more dangerous, like every face could be hiding something. I clutched the notebook tight against my chest as though it were fragile, though in truth, it felt more like dynamite. Carl walked beside me, his lips pressed into a thin line. He hadn't said much since reading that page. We got back into the leather seats burned hot from the sun, but neither of us noticed. I opened the notebook again, flipping back to the page with the red X. The name stared back at me, bold and familiar. It wasn't just a name, it was Earl Jensen, my neighbor, not Carl, another neighbor, a man I'd known for nearly 15 years. He lived just groceries, a boy pushing a cart too big for him, an old woman struggling with her bags. Everything looked so normal, yet my life had been flipped upside down in the span of hours. I turned to Carl. "We can't just drive around blind. We need to figure out what Luke was trying to tell me, and we need to decide fast. Do we confront Earl, or do we go somewhere safe and dig deeper into this notebook?" Carl leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "Earl is dangerous, that much I'm sure of. Luke's warning wasn't casual, but he might also hold the key to what's going on. If you walk up to his house now, though, you'll be walking into the lion's den." I thumbed through the notebook again. More pages filled with dates, half-coded notes, initials that made no sense. Luke had written, like a man who knew time was short. One sentence jumped out at me, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Dad, if anything happens to me, don't trust Earl until you know the whole story." I swallowed hard. Until you know the whole story. That meant there was something hidden in these pages. Carl pointed at the notebook. "This isn't just random scribbling. Luke was leaving you a map. We need to crack it, and we need somewhere private. Not your house, not mine. Somewhere no one will think to look. I thought for a moment, my mind drifting back to Luke's childhood, to weekends spent fishing by the Alabama River, to the little cabin my father had built decades ago, out in the woods near Wetumpka. No one had been there in years. It was quiet, secluded, forgotten by most. "I know a place," I said finally. "It's not far. We can work through this notebook there. No one will find us." Carl studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. But understand, once we go down this road, there's no turning back. Whatever Luke was involved in, it's bigger than you and me, and it's going to test everything you thought you knew about your son and your neighbors." The words sent a chill crawling up my spine. I turned the key, the Impala sputtering back to life. My hands still shook, but there was a strange fire in my chest now, a father's determination. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I took one last glance in the mirror. The sedan was gone for now, but the storm Luke had left behind was only just beginning. The road out of Montgomery stretched long and winding, lined with tall pines that swayed under the weight of the late afternoon heat. The city slowly fell behind us, replaced by the quiet hum of cicadas and the smell of damp earth. I hadn't been out this way in years. My father's cabin sat tucked deep in the woods near Wetumpka, a place where time seemed to stand still. When Luke was a boy, we used to spend weekends there fishing, building campfires, roasting marshmallows. He'd chase lightning bugs in jars, while I told him stories my own father once told me. Now every mile closer felt heavier, like those memories had been wrapped in chains. Carl sat in the passenger seat, flipping through the notebook again. He muttered, mostly to himself, tracing the margins with his finger. "These aren't random notes. Look," he kept circling dates, "but the initials don't match names in his will. They look like locations maybe, or meetings." I glanced at him, then back at the road. "You think it's a code?" Carl nodded. "Your son wasn't just scribbling. He knew whoever got this after him would need guidance. Look here, 3 dates, all within the past 6 months. And next to them sets of letters, MC, HR, SJ, each one marked with a star. That means something." The letter meant nothing to me at first, but then a memory hit. Luke had mentioned people by their initials sometimes. Back when we talked about his projects, he said it was easier than explaining their names. Carl flipped another page. This one was darker, literally. Luke had pressed so hard into the paper the pen had nearly torn it. The words were shaky, rushed. "Dad, don't go alone. Trust is rare. The truth is buried in what they don't want you to see." My chest tightened. My boy had known danger was coming. He had written this with the weight of fear sitting on his shoulders. Carl exhaled slowly, tapping the page. "He left this for you. Whatever he was tangled in, he wanted you to finish what he started, or at least understand." The cabin road appeared at last, little more than a dirt trail swallowed by trees. The Impala bounced over rocks and roots until we came to the clearing. There it was, weathered wood, sagging porch, windows clouded with dust. It looked exactly as it had when my father left it behind. I killed the engine, and silence fell. Not city silence, but the deep stillness of the woods. Only the chirp of crickets and the distant call of a crow filled the air. We unloaded what little we had and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of cedar and old smoke. Dust danced in the light from the single cracked window. I set the notebook on the wooden table, the same table where Luke once drew silly cartoons with crayons, while I fixed fishing rods. My throat tightened at the memory, but I forced myself to stay focused. Carl sat across from me, flipping back to the starred dates. He spread them out, making notes of his own. "If I'm right, these aren't just initials. They line up with places in Montgomery. MC could be Montgomery Courthouse. HR might be Hunter Road. SJ, maybe St. Jude's Hospital." I leaned closer, my pulse quickening. "That means he was leaving me places to check." Carl nodded grimly. "And if those places are connected, they're where we'll find the truth." I stared at the notebook, at Luke's handwriting, shaky and urgent. My son had been running out of time, yet even in his last days he was thinking of me. He had laid out a trail, and now, sitting in that old cabin, I realized this wasn't just about uncovering what happened to him. It was about surviving long enough to follow the map he left behind. That night in the cabin, Carl spread Luke's notebook on the table. The initials were clear: MC, HR, SJ. 3 locations, 3 clues. We start with Montgomery Courthouse, Carl said firmly. Public place, easier to blend in. If Luke left something, it'll be. I nodded, but before I could reply, a sound cut through the silence. A twig snapping outside. Carl froze. We exchanged a glance. Slowly he reached for the old shotgun my father kept mounted above the fireplace. I crept to the window. Through the glass I saw nothing but trees, but the feeling lingered. Someone had been close, watching. Carl whispered, "We can't stay here long. They know we've got the notebook." The chase today proved it. I packed the folder and notebook back into my bag. My hands shook, but my mind was set. Then we move at dawn, straight to the courthouse. We find out what my son wanted me to know. Carl gave a grim nod, and we pray we get there before they do. The cabin went dark. Sleep never came. All I could think about was Luke, his warning, his fear, his last words on paper. "Don't let Earl near Dad." By sunrise we were back on the road, the Impala rolling toward Montgomery Courthouse. My stomach churned the whole way. Luke had circled this place for a reason. We parked a block away and walked in like 2 men with business to handle. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with lawyers, clerks, and people fighting traffic tickets. Ordinary chaos. Carl led the way to the records office. If Luke hid something, it's in the public files. That's the safest way to bury a secret in plain sight. I handed the clerk my son's name. She typed, frowned, then pulled out a slim folder. "Strange," she muttered. He had no open cases, but this file was flagged. My pulse hammered as she slid it across the counter. Inside were copies of property transfers. At first glance they meant nothing, but Carl's eyes narrowed. He tapped one signature, Earl Jensen. There it was, my neighbor, my friend. Earl's name appeared again and again, tied to shell companies, shady purchases, even land near Hunter Road, the second set of initials from Luke's notes. Carl leaned close and whispered, "Your son uncovered a corruption trail. Earl's at the center of it." I felt the blood drain from my face. Earl wasn't just a neighbor. He was part of something dirty, something Luke had tried to expose. And now, because I had the notebook, I was in the middle of it too. The courthouse file left no doubt. Earl Jensen, my neighbor, my so-called friend, was knee-deep in dirty deals. Luke had found it, and it cost him his life. Carl and I drove straight to Hunter Road, the second clue in Luke's notes. What we found was no accident. A run-down warehouse, its windows boarded, its lot half empty, and parked right out front, Earl's truck. I felt rage boil in my chest. I wanted to storm inside, demand answers, but Carl's hand on my shoulder stopped me. Think, not feel. Luke wouldn't want you rushing in blind. We circled to the back, slipping through a cracked door. Inside, records lay scattered, boxes of ledgers, contracts, even photos, proof of Earl's deals, proof Luke had been right. And then Earl's voice echoed through the warehouse. Calm, cold. I warned him to stop digging. He didn't listen, and now his old man thinks he can finish the job. He stepped out of the shadows, a gun glinting in his hand. For a moment everything froze. The man who grilled burgers on the 4th of July, who lent me tools, who smiled at my son's graduation, was pointing a weapon at me. But before Earl could pull the trigger, Carl moved fast. The shotgun roared, the echo rattling the walls. Earl dropped, his weapon skidding across the floor. The silence after was deafening. I stood there shaking, staring down at the man I once trusted. Then I looked at the files. The evidence Luke had died for. Carl's voice broke the silence. We've got enough to end this, but it's up to you. Do we hand it all to the police, or walk away and protect what's left of your family? My throat burned. Luke didn't die for me to stay quiet. We take it in, and that's what we did. The days that followed were a blur. Statements, detectives, headline. Earl's network unraveled piece by piece. Corruption that had been rotting Montgomery for years came to light, but none of it brought Luke back. Standing at his grave weeks later, notebook in my hands, I whispered, "I heard your will, son. I heard every word you left me, and I'll carry it until my last breath." The wind rustled the trees, and for the first time since his death, I felt a strange peace. My boy hadn't died in vain. His truth had lived on. Subscribe to Story Globe for more powerful, emotional stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. And if Luke's courage touched you, share this video, because sometimes the truth can only survive if we pass it on.